queen c4, king e3, queen c5, king e4.
Right.
And now I think queen c6 is a draw. But if you play
Right.
queen c4, knight d4, I'm not sure what kind of territory we're in anymore, because suddenly there's no checks and white is super advanced.
Yep.
And it could be that there's only like 1 or 2 moves that hold.
Yeah, now we already saw that position. Only 3 moves were drawing for black and everything else was losing. So black has to be careful.
And look at this. Magnus has switched which pawn his rook is behind, and at any moment he could just push e5, right? He doesn't have to push the f pawn. He can choose the e1, and he gets to dictate the action here. But
this is going to be so hard for Jan to hold, because he's just going to keep pushing this forever.
Yeah,
and anytime there is no 50-move draw or 3-move repetition here. The position will slowly advance, and at some point, the critical moment will come, and the queen will have to find all the accurate checks to hold.
I think that at some point we will see a position where black has only 1 or 2 moves to make a draw.
Yeah, exactly.
At some point we will have this moment in the game where black has to play super accurately. Right now he can probably make any move and it's still objectively a draw, but that's not going to last forever.
Yeah, and that's why the table bases, although useful, it is a little bit misleading on the complexity of this position. I would lose this position with both sides.
That's definitely not true. White has no risk of losing unless you blunder everything.
Have you ever seen me play chess?
I'm not going to answer that question. But here, the knight went to g3. So it's clear he wants to start pushing his pawns. Jan says queen d2 check. If you go king f3, there's queen d1. And then the rook can come back to e2. The knight is perfectly placed on g3. So Fabi, as I look at this, we talk about careless checks. I mean, rook e2 to block the check. You can check on the third.
Well, not right now.
King f3.
Okay, sorry, king f3.
In the live position.
Check here.
Rook e2. And if you give a careless check like queen d3 and king g4, the king's escaping. You go queen d7, I go f5, right? I can push forward.
And this is what I was talking about in terms of careless checks, And if you keep careless checking, you might careless check yourself off the board.
Yeah, we're probably still in draw territory, but white is starting to advance. So after king f3, rook e2, queen b3, I suspect he'll play king g2. The king cannot be checked there, and then he can try to push his pawns in relative peace, at least for the moment. At some point, the checks will begin again, but for the moment after king g2, black doesn't have a checking square which doesn't lose the queen.
Right.
And then white will play f5 next, and then e5, and then the checks will begin again, and we'll have to start calculating stuff. So Jan is still playing quickly. They both have a healthy amount of time, and we're about to break the world record for longest world championship game.
We are nearing history here. Will it be a decisive game today? I have no idea how to answer that question, but I know that either way, we have broken history here in the 2021 World Chess Championship, because the move rook to d2 officially makes this game the longest game in World Chess Championship history. These two guys made it happen.
Maybe he doesn't want f5. Maybe he wants rook to d5, and then the king sneaks around, king h3, g4, and the rook and knight cover checks from pretty much everywhere.
Do you think either of these guys, or ask it this way, do you think Magnus knows that this is objectively probably a draw? I would guess yes. That makes no difference to him, but I would guess he's probably aware that with best play, this should hold.
I don't think they 100% know that.
Right.
Okay.
But I think they assume, because this sort of endgame is known with, well, let's say not with E and F, but with other configurations of pawns.
Yep.
They assume that's a draw. They both don't look like either of them is thinking this game is going one way or the other right now. But that's still different from, knowing how to draw it or how to win it.
Right.
Magnus has won with a lot less.
Right.
He's at positions where you've seen even material, and he just squeezes, inches forward, finds a little hole in his opponent's position, and is able to take advantage. But one of the critical things here is e4 is protected, and even if the move queen takes f4 were possible, if we're legal, then rook f2. Mm-hmm. So the black king, while it probably needs to establish itself in front of the pawns rather than off on the side of the board, because then the pawns just start going, it makes it harder for black to really attack the pawns. Even when they're hanging, sometimes you shouldn't take it because there could be a pin. And so I like the way that Magnus is doing this. He's not rushing, and he's leaving Jan with more decisions to make. And we see Jan bring the queen to b3. He's playing active defense here. But what Fabiano said, at some point the king would like to run through h3 to g4. And in the event of rook d5 right now, you still won't be able to take on f4 even if you can attack it, because rook f5 check. So if we show this for a second, like rook d5, queen e3, king h3. Like you're not threatening the pawn f4 because it's rook f5 check. So white can try his best to run the king around this way. It's not going to be easy because black can take away the squares with his queen, but that's something that is in the cards potentially.
Maybe he can also give a check first on d8. Rook to d8, king, let's say, some square. And the king might be a bit more vulnerable to checks. Like, let's say now here, rook to d5. Now queen e3 is no longer a move, right? Knight to f5 wins the queen directly. And it really doesn't change so much. But yeah, let's say queen c2, and now white plays king to f3 or h3. Tries to get that king slowly up the board without allowing too many checks or a perpetual check.
Right, and well, we see that Magnus grabs a piece, as we know chess players love to do. They're a little nervous. They fiddle with pieces here, and the queen on b3, it feels like if the king tries to escape via h3, maybe that queen comes to f3, and just make sure that while the knight on g3 is a great defender, it's not going to be able to get active because it's pinned and the king has no escape for white. So, did he just push a pawn?
I think he might have.
No,
rook
rook
d5.
d5. Okay, that makes
It feels like a very good rook on d5.
Yes.
Very actively placed. It blocks off a lot of the queen's influence. So there's no, like the queen can't get to e6 or to g8.
Right. And yeah, I mean, when we look at this position here, so where do you think this queen should go? Like, what's the ideal defense?
I was thinking black can try to give checks, queen to b2.
Yep.
Let's say queen b2, king h3,
Yep.
queen to h8, king to g4.
Oh, so you're trying to check from the front. I bet.
Yeah, I'm trying to check anywhere I can.
Okay, so you're saying it's not careless, right? So queen b2 check?
Well, it might be careless, but it might lead to the same sort of position because I don't know if black can really stop white from advancing the king now.
Right.
Queen to g7,
Is there rook g5?
rook to g5, queen to d7.
Yep. So the rook can come to f5 with check. The knight can block on f5. The pawn can block on f5.
I don't like the knight blocking because then the queen comes to d1, and I don't think you can stop those checks
That's a
anymore.
very good point. That the knight blocking, all of a sudden there's checks, and yeah, you're not stopping that.
But after rook to f5, black has to make a tough choice where to put that king. Anywhere it goes, it's either vulnerable to a check or a fork by the knight,
Right.
potentially.
Right.
And it also gets in the way of black's queen checks. For example, if king to e7, maybe white plays king to g5, and then rook to e5, knight f5, you see how we're slowly creeping up the board.
Right, and that's the idea you mentioned before, and black had an h-pawn in some of these types of positions. So this could be really scary. We'll hop back to the live position. Seems some moves were, in fact, played. The rook on d5, and
King to e7, rook to e5 was played.
yes, right? So,
And king to f7.
so the check on e5, king to f7, and yeah,
I don't think much has changed. White will probably try to run the king down the board now, maybe with king to h3, or sorry, run the king up the board rather. King to h3 makes a lot of sense. Maybe then the queen goes on f3, and that's sort of annoying for white. So, okay, Magnus continues giving checks because, well, he has time, right? He has 50 moves between every pawn move he can make.
He actually, if we think about how many pawn moves are left, we're looking at 50 moves times a lot, which is more math than I am qualified to do.
I think there's something really important, though, about the rook being on f5.
Okay.
That when the king goes to h3 and the black queen comes to f3, just to show this, white can play king h4. If the rook went on f5, f4 would be hanging with check. But for king h4, now we're renewing all sorts of different options that black needs to consider, and it's really difficult at this moment.
Well, and now we see rook f5, king e8 has been played on the board. And is it time?
It is time.
Is it time? Nope. Wait, no, we're pushing.
He
E5.
pushed. He pushed.
e5.
Okay.
Now the rook might go to f6.
F6.
That f6 square is a beautiful one for the king to slowly go up because look at how much space white is taking away from black's queen checks. Suddenly, where do you, let's say the king is on h3 and rook is on f6.
Yep.
Where do you check that king from?
Yep.
c8, it doesn't look like a great square to check from, and the king will anyway move up. If the rook is on f6 and king on h4, black has only one square to check from, which is h2. I guess potentially h7 as well.
But it is interesting, I think, and instructive for the viewers to say how we keep saying this should be a draw, yet white is making progress. So what is it about the position that will eventually be a draw? It's that white will eventually have to expand far enough that the board opens up fully for the queen to chase the king, right? And it's easier said than done, but or I ask you guys are the grand. What is? I was assuming that's the reason, but what is the reason?
This may be bold, but I think that's more likely that white wins a position like this than black draws.
I'm starting to feel that too, especially with the rook coming to f6.
Yeah.
It's a draw, objectively, but it might come down to only moves at some point.
Right.
It might be that white's pawns advance all the way, and at that point you have only checks here and there. I don't think that that's realistic for black to find.
Right.
It's much easier for white because he has there's no risk. He can just, he also doesn't have any responsibility with time. He has all the time in the world to advance his pawns and pieces.
Right, here, for example, the rook is pinned. You can play king g4 to defend that rook, and let's say black passes, then you can play knight e4, maybe knight g5, and then the king can go king h5, king to g6. That's asking for a lot, I'm aware of that, but those are the type of things where if that king gets all the way in there, you're gonna not have enough checks because your king on e8 actually limits the black queen from continuing to check the king as the white king marches up the board.
If white gets knight g5 and king g6, I think it's over. I think that's just winning because you can no longer check that king anymore. And then white will play like rook f7, e6, f5, and the pawns push themselves at that point.
Yeah.
So
we're already in that, and that's what we've been saying from the beginning, regardless of the table base, that it's a winning endgame for white. Black has to find the only moves.
Can we check the table base now?
White wins.
No.
That's what it says.
White wins.
Oh wow, white's
According to the table base, white is officially winning, which means what was the move that it was right here.
Queen e6, which is
apparently queen e6 was the losing move, and the only two moves that drew were both moves that maintained the long diagonal. And it is instructive still, even though, again, it's not to reiterate the point I made, but the point is you have to have your queen in a position where she's reaching the whole board. You can't put your queen in a position where her options are limited.
right.
And
This is still the queen had to defend from g2, h2, those squares,
yeah.
and for some reason white can't advance
And so the point
as
is
much.
now if the king comes up, white has moves like queen g2, or sorry, black has moves like queen g2. And obviously I would lose this game, as I already self-deprecated, okay? I would lose this to anybody. That
I think
said,
most of us would lose this.
Yes.
Look at the bar.
look at the bar. Like,
It is officially just winning territory.
Yep.
And everybody can see it. And I think that Jan might know it because if your queen is on h6, you got nothing going on for you here.
Yep.
The white king is marching up the board already at h4. Maybe we'll keep going. And those pawns, what are you going to do about those pawns?
yep. I'm not going to do nothing about the pawns. They're not my pawns, Robert.
And let's say queen to g6 or queen to h7. He played queen to h7, and it's going to be similar.
Okay.
I want to try queen h7, rook to g5, because I want to get that rook to g7 to fully
Oh,
cut
wow.
off the
And
black
then
king.
you're
But
threatening
rook
knight
g8
f6.
check is a threat too.
Rook to g8 is
Oh
an
my
immediate
gosh.
threat, but let's say the queen goes back to b1.
Okay.
Rook to g7. Maybe it's not good to cut that king off.
Yeah, actually, this puts us back in a weird drawing territory because the queen is in a more
It feels like
open board.
I already messed it up and possibly.
Well, this is just so hard, but it's
So
obviously
queen to h7.
we're gonna be diving into all of this. Just
Can he play
remind
king
everybody,
to g5? King to g5 now.
it's not on the board yet, though.
Right, but wait, where's
can
your-
he do
after
so?
Queen g8 check,
King to h6.
Yeah, exactly.
And then fully invade with rook f6, f5, e6. The king on h6 can only be checked from h8. King g6.
No, and then
Queen g8, knight g7. King to e7, e6. A rook f7, and
This
it's
is
over.
this is just
yeah, the
nutty.
pawns go. And there's no checks. You've blocked them all. So queen h7 played.
King g5.
So yeah, you don't want to let the queen go back to b1. We were talking about that
Yeah.
earlier at the
Yeah.
moment when Jan only had those two moves that drew. So wait, the queen takes f5 is not a threat, by the way.
White can maybe play
e6.
e6.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Queen
E6.
f5 is not a threat.
Because of knight
There's
g7.
a knight g7 check. So e6,
With the
because-
threat of rook f7.
the threat of rook f7, and you can't ever take this pawn e6 anyway with queen e7 check, like you're not taking this pawn. That can't be captured, right?
But also queen e7, rook f6.
Yep, and you're frozen.
Secures it.
Yeah,
But king
this-
g4 might also be very good.